To have you here. Happy New Year to those of you that we haven't seen yet. And we're so happy to be back with Journeys of Growth and Belonging. Today we have a very, very special and dear storyteller with us. And in the spirit of these gatherings, for those of you who have been here before, we like to kick them off with connection before content. So in a couple of minutes, well, in about 1 minute here, I'm going to send us into small groups where we will answer the question, why did you choose to show up here today? And Felipe is joining. Funny enough, I live in a very small town in Brazil in the mountains, and Felipe was living in the town next to me, which is funny because it's really in the middle of nowhere. So it's a small world. Welcome, Felipe. Good to see you. So here we are. I'm going to, you'll be in groups of 3 to 4, and we'll be in here for about, what do we say, Jeff, 10 minutes, 8 minutes?
Yeah, let's do 8. It's an unround number. It's an even number, but not a zero number, I guess, to play it out.
Okay, sounds good. Here we are. Hi, JP. Can you hear me?
Hi, Maya.
Hi, good to see you.
Glad to see you. How are you?
Doing well, doing all right, yeah. How are you?
Having issues joining via computer, so I'm on a phone, but I'm glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. You look really dapper today.
Thank you.
Well, you always do. So everyone's in breakouts right now. Would you like to join one? They just went.
I'd love to. Thank you. Yes.
Oh, I'm going to send you to room 3.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back.
Hi, friends.
How are you?
Good, good. How are you, Brad?
I'm glad to be here. Let's put it that way.
Good to have you here.
A challenge to get here because I went to the wrong Zoom site, but that spent some time there for a while and then came and figured out where I was. And came
I
back.
had a similar experience.
Technology has not been on my side lately. Anybody who joined the gift session back in December, my Zoom didn't let me put them into breakout rooms. That was fun.
Really?
So do we have a very small, intimate group?
I have about 14 people.
Oh, here we go. I was just waiting.
Back. Welcome back.
Beautiful.
Welcome back, everyone. So take a couple of minutes to see what struck you about that conversation you just had. Feel free to unmute. We're a small group.
I'll start. I was struck by a shared longing, I'll say, for almost like a refuge in dark times. I mean, winter is dark, but there's lots of dark things happening as well, whether it's work or society or whatever. And a surprisingly shared longing for this kind of space was what struck me. Thank you.
I love that, Michael. Yeah, what struck me from my conversation with Brad was Brad said something that resonated a lot with me, which is escaping from versus escaping into. And I really appreciated that because I do feel like this space is special in that way.
What struck me about my group's conversation was there was a variety of folks who have been a part of the series and some who have not. And in that variety, it mattered that we just met each other where we're at and created quick belonging and curiosity and appreciation. I love that in these conversations, I don't always get to attend, but when I do, I just step right in and go at it.
Thanks, JP. All right, well, I'm going to take a moment to pass it over to Jeff, my wonderful partner, co-host in this series. So take it over, Jeff.
Thank you, Maya. It's a joy to be with you as we are today and with others. Lies many familiar faces from the recent and the past, as well as some new faces. So hopefully as we finish this conversation, we will no longer be strangers. We will be in this community that we are creating right now and right here, which is what I love. Each time we come together, we create a new community. So yeah, so I'll share a little bit about one of the reasons why I chose to be here is I'm thrilled to have Cormac, a person I said one of my dear friends in this world. Although I have not been able to connect as much recently, you're always part of my work and my being, Cormac. So thanks for saying yes to begin to move in today. And many of you had a chance to see some of Cormac's bio and thing. He's been very active in the asset-based community development work with John McKnight and beyond from the Institute, and also very much in Europe as well. And he's been, what I love about Cormac's work, not only is he a great person and a good true friend, but also he really gets to the boots on the ground work. He has immersed himself over the years, not just talking about community and neighborhoods, but going to communities and neighborhoods and really helping them make a huge difference. And I just found a few days ago, Cormac, my shirt from Long Beach that we got with the Long Beach community. I had a chance to be on a little bit of a tour with him in the community of Long Beach. And so just a lot of great memories. I'm just thrilled that we're going to be able to hear a little bit more from him today on his journey. That's what this is about. It's really, we've all been on a journey. These are our stories and our journeys that we go on, and just a chance to listen, to learn, and for me, more importantly, to connect. And so for me, this is a nice refuge to get away from some of the things that are happening, to be with folks. So with that, Cormac, thank you for saying yes as we move into a dialogue and a conversation. And I think as we kind of start these pieces, and I obviously can share anything you want to about some of the things you've been doing, but the kind of the kickoff question that we kind of use, Cormac, is why did you choose to be on this journey of convening, building communities in the work that you're doing? And you can kind of take that wherever you'd like to go with us today.
Thanks, Jeff. And look, thanks also to you and Maya and Peter, and see Peter Poole on the call as well, and everybody here really for creating a sanctuary. When I think about why I do the work I do, largely I think it wasn't something that was planned for. It was something that really has grown up around a set of yearnings, and to use Michael's beautiful term. So I think many of us have our ear to the ground, and we're listening closely. So when invitations come, we tend to say yes. So a lot of my life and my work has been a rolling set of invitations. to be in community. So that's part of it. I think another part of it is part, like, we're all so autobiographical by very definition. We're storied beings. And I brought my story into my work, which I guess, like, very fundamentally, I understood the difference in being in a community and being of a community. And, there's such a fundamental difference, isn't there? So when I started my own work, I started working in Ireland, and I suppose entered into the effort to be helpful at those in those early days, with a view that I wanted, as a psychologist, to do something which built a bridge between particularly kids who weren't even in community necessarily. They had been taken away from families. They'd been taken away from their neighborhoods, and were in very large institutions. And I think that the really big awakening for me was around about 92, 93, when it really struck home to me that even though we'd taken children out of very big institutions, religious institutions, and in the narrative of strangers, gods, and monsters, we always like to put the folks that we're dealing with in one or the other. So we thought of these institutions as run by monsters. We had lots and lots of evidence of abuse and so forth. So you could really sort of make sense of what you're doing. And of course, if you find a monster, you get to be the hero or you get to be scared. And I like the hero role. So that kind of idea that we were taking people out and we were bringing them into what we call community care, putting kids into smaller, houses, homes, and neighborhoods and villages, but not actually in any way doing anything to ensure that they were of that community. And I think that's been a theme throughout my work, throughout my life. It's just like, how can I do something useful that enables particularly people who've been rendered the stranger at the edge to come in with their gifts and be recognized as a neighbor. Doesn't even have to be at the center, but at least to be of the place, to be missed on the days that you don't show up. And I want to be affirmative on this call, but boy, is there a hell of a lot of counterfeit community. I'm struck by how many people have community in their job title but don't have community in their heart. And how many people don't have community in their job title but do have community in their heart. Let's be affirmative about that too. So I kind of like to hang out with the second group of folks, and that's been the journey. So across many different countries, and we can maybe share some lessons that we've learned at the feet of citizens as we go on the call. But it's been rolling invitations ever since. I got out of working with the Irish Health Board, largely on a hunch. I met this guy, John McKnight, 30 years on. We co-authored a book just this year. So the very first book I read was the same year, not the first book I read, the first book I read from him in 1993, 30 years ago. And I met him that year, and 30 years on, in 2023, we're having fun talking with people through the lens of our new book. And incidentally, for those that are interested in community and the planet and things like that, this is also the 50th anniversary of Small is Beautiful, E.F. Schumacher's book. So there have been people who've been beating this drum for the longest time, and 50 years, is not long, but it's long enough. But I think it's a daily practice. One of the things somebody said to me recently, it's kind of the "are we there yet?" question. Are we ever going to get this message through? And I don't think it's a message that has a summit. It's a message that has a daily practice, a faithful commitment to it. And that's why I think Peter Block's work is particularly important in this space, because it takes us beyond something that's about the sustainability goals to something that's about deep relationship. Like if I said, somebody said to me, you're married to Colleen for over 20 years. How's it going? And I said, well, it's a sustainable relationship. We're meeting our sustainability development goals. You'd know there's something wrong with the relationship. And yet so often that's how we talk about communities. That's how we talk. And it's another form of othering, but we get to other while sounding really good. And so I'm quite interested in that too. What does that level of authenticity when you show up in community look like? So that as a useful outsider, you can also be invited to be of the place, even for the shortest of times.
Yeah, thank you, Cormac. A lot of things kind of striking me. I think it's as you asked about the journey. Was it almost, Cormac, that the journey kind of chose you? Was that piece? Was that what I'm hearing a little bit about?
I think so. And then I suppose different. Different people will find different aspects of you and your contribution useful, even though you may, like the helper and the helped is really interesting, isn't it? So, I mean, the person receiving the help is the person who defines what's helpful. And that really is about whether they feel it's useful or not in enabling them to actually, live their lives in crescendo, to really move into full expression and full expansiveness. And one of the things I think that really is particularly today striking me, because I'm working on another book, is if you just indulge me for a second on this, I'll try this out with you as a group. But I keep thinking about the myth of Icarus. And because the book that we're writing about is really reflecting on both the great potential and the great harm that design has brought to communities. And it's really striking me, that we really give Icarus such a hard time for flying too close to the sun. And we accuse the sun, him, of being full of hubris. But actually, it's Daedalus. It's the father. So I think I'm really struck by that, that there's huge power and potential in the kind of role that in some way I've been invited into, which a lot of the time is being alongside communities and trying to find ways within which they themselves can reweave their own story and kind of create a tapestry with the various threads of possibility that they're working with. And I mean, I'm really, really struck so often, and it's to the power of this work, by how often we're surrounded by other folks who have designs on doing something different, rescuing, fixing, possibly sometimes exploiting. And it's a contested space, Jeff, it feels to me. So as well as being invited in, I think sometimes when you're invited in, there's an ethics about staying and being not faithful to a model, but faithful to the relationships. So one of the things I've always wanted to try to think deeply about in my practice is how there could be great space in the togetherness that I had with people. So how, in a sense, right, I've been invited in, and that's a wonderful privilege. But at the same time, the question is, how can I lead by stepping backwards? So I'm not taking on functions, because always in that invite, there's a kind of a hidden seduction. See, some of the invite is of course, it's affirmative and it's positive, but some is, it's a storied invite. So sometimes communities, in inviting an outsider to come in, are saying through their story, the only way things are going to get better around here is if somebody like you, Cormac, comes in to make it better. And I think part of the challenge is to not collude with that particular part of the invitation. So the invitations are multi-layered, and we have to really challenge naivety. There's a lot of naivety. When you come in from the outside is the orphan at the edge of the village. You're a guest in the lives of the people that have invited you in. And there's more than a 50-50 chance that you'll do harm in that dance. It's really Russian roulette, if you forgive the use of the term, given what's going on in the world at the moment.
Maya has a follow-up question here for you.
Yeah, I think that this idea of coming in as the outsider or and being invited in a sense where you want to avoid othering in any sense possible. You want to avoid coming in as a stranger. How do you cope, or how do you manage that, being an outsider that doesn't do harm, but instead is loving and caring and steps back?
Well, just to use a vernacular example, I mean, I can go to visit with friends, right? My wife and I have friends who are couples, and we regularly have a meal together. It doesn't mean, we have to live in each other's pockets for the rest of our lives. We can come, be guests, and leave. So some of the process of being a good guest is knowing when to leave, being able to read the room, right? So we all have friends who outstay their welcome, right? And we call them people who are, well, we have different labels, but I think there's something in that, isn't there? There's kind of knowing how to be a good guest, knowing when to step back. It's like in parenting, if I button it, if I zip it, if I tie it for my children, they learn that I do it better. So the big question in being a good guest is not what am I going to do to be helpful, but what am I not going to do, which will create space within which the people in the conversation can form community and figure out what they want to do together. So actually the question, how do I bring value add in terms of what am I going to do to or for the people that I'm with, is probably a redundant question. It's running us into a brick wall or a cul-de-sac. I think a more interesting question is, how can I use my privilege to and skill set? Like I don't want to demean the expertise. I don't want to say that I'm just coming in swinging my hands. I do bring a craft. I bring an art form. But in that art form, there's something about being able to think about, well, what's it for? And I think it's for space creation so that people can figure out what they value and they want to bring. And this is part of the dilemma, in a world that's all about commodifying opportunities, right? You go in, you want to try and turn these people into clients and repeat business. And I guess what we're saying is, well, no, if you really want to be of use, see them as fellow citizens with as sharp a mind and as noble a heart, and kind of work out a way that your value add proposition is that when you leave, there's legacy they own. And I think, so yeah, there's much to be kind of understood about the work of being with communities, which is measured by what happens after you've gone. That old kind of Lao Tzu turn of phrase, and of the best leader, they will say, we did it ourselves.
Yeah, that's great, Cormac. What kind of what's shown up for me, we've talked in the past about the dominant narrative versus the alternative narrative around command and control. And if we're not careful, our best intent, we will move into the dominant command and the control. And how do we? And I love the art form, almost the dance, right? How do I offer a craft? I love the word craft, expertise to the folks, but also not assume they might want or need my art or expertise. And how do I also invite them to share their art expertise as it goes? So I think it's a nice image I'm getting from the dance piece. Exactly. So you've talked a little bit about, Cormac, and some of the key milestones on your journey. So if maybe other milestones you've seen in this journey, and I would say in addition to that, what has surprised you the most as you've been in these different pieces about yourself, about others, or anything that might be surprising as you've encountered some of these milestones?
Yeah, the thing that really surprises me and delights me a lot is what people do with the basic framing that we're talking about, and where that scaffold opens up new prairies, new vistas, new possibilities that I could never in a million years have imagined. So, you know, moments like I remember many, look, it's more than 15 years ago now, but being in Rwanda and working with the Canadian Foundation in the Gasabo district just outside of Kigali. And we were musing, you know, in a school. The school was built by hand, by parents. And, you know, well, just very quickly, what actually emerged out of a very simple set of conversations there, which really centered around trying to listen to what people cared about themselves enough to act on, rather than asking them what they needed. And it's so easy to default to a conversation, you know, which started with our kids are hungry, to very quickly start moving into some kind of food poverty response. And that there's something in the human condition that is very valid in wanting to meet those needs, but in holding the space and saying, well, what would you like to do with that? What, you know, what would you like to work on? And then how might we be useful to that? You know, the Wellspring Foundation was a Canadian foundation that had really learned to do this asset-based community development work, which kind of says, you know, start with what's strong, not with what's wrong. So don't just assume that need is 100% of the conversation. There are resources, there are assets. And actually, if you start there, you're going to end up with a much more sensitive response and a much more indigenously respectful response, where the community are in the driving seat rather than the facilitator or the outside agency or whatnot, which has become so much part of what we see in Rwanda post-genocide. But one of the things that really struck me that day was that the people who built the school, the parents and the kids said, well, you know, we should plant kale and we should plant banana trees and we should, you know, think about how we can sustain those. And somebody made the point, well, that's a good idea, but we then need to think about fertilizing those, because most of the kids are coming sometimes, you know, maybe 10 kilometers away from the school. And so, yeah, they're not going to be able to have the resource, the time to also tend gardens and whatnot. And out of that conversation came a social enterprise called GWiz. Now you got to hear this. So GWiz comes from the idea there were no school toilets surrounding the campus. So they built pretty rudimentary toilets. But when they built them, they irrigated the ground so that they could harvest the urine. And they mixed water with urine. Anybody who's kind of got a bit of an agricultural background knows where I'm going with this. Because if you get the right ratio of urine with water, it's a really, really effective fertilizer. And they generated so much of that they were actually selling excess fertilizer in billy cans, hence the name GWiz. But what surprised me is, because I've always very cautious about scale. I'm much more interested in how things proliferate. Scale always seems to suggest standardization and, you know, industrialized models. But I remember a few years after that conversation, which really tickles me even today when I think about it. But listening to the stories that emerged from stories like that, to a point now where 49 of those schools have connected with 400 villages. And there's been community organizing in those villages that has really not alone kind of mobilized, you know, community responses like desilting of wells and whatever, but it's really changed the power dynamic between communities and those that serve communities, sometimes those that exploit communities. So it isn't just that, you know, there's a self-help or a mutual aid that's emerging in the conversation. There's also a real relocation of authority. So as people in those contexts got more of a sense of cohesion, more of a sense of inclusion across, you know, gender, more of a sense of listening to the voice of young people and people that would have been quite marginalized, and seeing them for their gifts. They actually cohesed the power. You know, the village literally started functioning like an organism. And in many respects, that kind of agency, that authority, when they sit at the table and they're talking to an NGO or even to a government official, you can hear a power that comes from not status or privilege or, you know, certainly not money, but it comes from the hard work of building real coalition. And it's pretty overwhelming for somebody who isn't showing up to a conversation with authenticity or compassion, but, you know, is out to do the community over, because they don't last very long in the conversation. And some would call it a soft power, but I think it's incredibly consequential. You know, we've seen that over and over again in places we've worked in. It surprises and delights, but I suppose in a sense it shouldn't surprise me, because you know, it's the way the world works if we know how to go with that energy.
Yeah. I love the Gee Whiz story. I'll never forget that one for sure. It's a great piece. So I'm curious, Cormac, just kind of thinking through. I know some of the folks in this community now, we're dealing with the, you know, actual neighborhoods. Some of us are trying to impart and impact community within corporations or just anywhere we find ourselves interacting. And my question, kind of tying back to some of the things that you've experienced, is that as we move into these communities as a host, as a convener, how are some of the folks dealing with the losing of power? The ones that had been in control, whether it be the formal leaders of the organization or in communities and neighborhoods, you know, government and things. How are they? Do you find them kind of letting go and staying? Do they leave? I'm just curious, how do we, because it's a letting go process that people are used to, and a lot of them don't know any other way. Yeah, I'm just curious, how do we compassionately work with those folks who are latched onto the traditional power?
Yeah, you see, I think an awful lot of it probably comes down to how the person themselves is coping within a total institution. So, yeah, many of the people we work with in municipalities or in health institutions, or even with big corporations that are trying to do something from a corporate social responsibility perspective, have never had conversations like this, to be fair to them. So often they come in with what is a dominant narrative around what it is to be helpful. And our dominant narrative, particularly Western narrative, is a very scarcity-based model. So it says you find a need and you fill it, you know, and we saw some of that during COVID. You know, there were people running around giving people food parcels, whether they wanted them or not, you know, and delivering prescriptions to people who didn't even necessarily ask for them. So I guess one of the things that probably you see as a differential is once people have had the opportunity to think that another way I can be useful, aside from providing something, is I can precipitate a culture or an environment within which people can actually generate and create and produce themselves. And for a lot of people, that's quite new. So I think sometimes the differential is, have people been given the opportunity to actually just reflect on how exactly they want to show up in the conversations before they arrive in? I think if they haven't, they kind of work off the story that they receive from society. You know, you grow up, I grew up in the west of Ireland, and I grew up at a time when, you know, if you think about what it meant to be helpful, well, I didn't know a lot of professions. So if you wanted to be helpful, you became a teacher or you became a preacher. That was it. Or otherwise you just went off and you worked in some industry, right? Unless you had a wealthy mom and dad, and, you know, but broadly that was the story. And then if people wanted to be helpful in their lives, they volunteered. And so I think what's emerging in the world is that people are having to really think very deeply about how they show up in those spaces. And the difference I'm seeing is people who have had the opportunity to think about being a precipitator, being a catalyst, or being a facilitator actually come in, and they're very, very sensitive, and they're very, very useful to communities. And the folks that don't, and I'm trying to be really fair to people, I think it's either because they're in an organization where they're afraid. They're kind of measured by key performance indicators. They're measured by mistakes that they make, and they're fearful. So they go in and it's very instrumental, you know, so they'll do what's easy to do. And the easiest thing to do if you go in under those circumstances is, first of all, do a needs analysis. what's broken, what's pathological, what's missing, and then to take a drop-down menu, stack, some kind of solutions that are pretty traditional, and hit your key performance indicator. So if you come in from a place of fear, or a place where you're receiving a traditional helper story, then likely is you're going to do a lot of harm. But what we're beginning to recognize now, and I think it is a shift, is increasingly people are going renegade. There are more and more heretics in their institutions that are occupying the gap between what the institution is demanding in the bureaucratic sense and what the community is yearning for, even if it doesn't know it fully itself. And this is a really special place because, it's like they say when you step off the train on the London Underground, mind the gap. So what we're doing is we're minding the gap. Now, I think what we're beginning to see through conversations like this is that we have to nurture each other. We are the gappers. And what we're really trying to do is nourish each other as a community of gappers. But I think that's a growing community. More and more whistleblowers, more and more heretics, more and more people understanding the dangers of the excess of domineering professionals who think that people will be better because they know best, and the possibilities that exist through relationship.
Beautiful. Yeah. So I got a new term, a gapper. I'm going to claim to be a gapper. So along with working with Peter Pula, I'm also a commoner. So I'm a commoner gapper is what we're moving into from the language. I love it. Love it. Good. I think Maya, follow up with Cormac.
Yeah, sure. As a former heretic, I will say, possibly, and attempting to be a gapper, I will say, you say there's no summit to this work. There's no kind of really an end goal or what success looks like, but in a time where building community within kind of the traditional international development, community development framework feels really like something that is commodified, and a lot of that could be due to fundraising structures and the fact that you have to show metrics that are really obsolete and outdated in order to continue, turning on the lights or keeping the lights on for an organization. What is your, I guess, what would be success for you? And what does that look like? And what can we kind of do, those of us who work in that space, to contribute to that?
Well, it's a great question. So I think the first thing is if we're being asked to do things to or for communities that they haven't asked, we're being asked to commit violence. And ethical practitioners will say no to that. And that's about courage. If we're being asked to do things that are harmful to Indigenous ways and the environment and Mother Nature in order to get funding, that's coercion. That's social engineering. That's undercutting charity. And an ethical practitioner will say no to that. So I suppose that's the first thing, kind of read the room. If you're being hosted by an organization or a donor that's asking you to do something that's unethical, then it's an ethical question. It's a relational question. And I don't want to moralize, but then it could be an organizing question. Do we have a trade union that needs to speak up? Do we have civil society groups that need to speak up? Right. So there's a couple of different, you need basically to do serious harm in the world, right? You need about 4 different factors to work together, broadly speaking. So you need a kind of an authoritarian culture. You need what I'd call high modernism, where you got lots and lots of people who are kind of in positions of really elite power, and they get to design stuff and they think they're God. You have to have a very, very weak civil society. That's really, really critical. And you probably need to have quite a weak kind of almost clientelistic mindset in general terms that just leaves the door open. If you get all those factors kind of working together, it's red flag time. So, we're in a really interesting moment, okay, where a lot of our civil society groups aren't as organized as they might be. And they're kind of saying, well, until the institutions get their act together, we're not going to move. But the institutions are not going to get their act together. The NGOs are not going to get their act together. The donors will not get their act together. We teach donors how to treat us. Practitioners and communities teach people that serve them how to treat them. And if we're handing the power over to them, then that's the problem. Because basically that's like taking the rudder off the boat and then asking why the boat is going all over the place. We are the rudder. It's called democracy. Now, here's the problem, right? And I just want to get this clear, because otherwise we kind of end up talking about donors and, how we meet the donors' expectations. So the basic issue here is we've got an inversion of democracy, where the role of the citizen is being defined as that which happens after the important work of the professional is done. The correct term for that is technocracy, where the experts are in charge. I have nothing against experts, right? But in a democracy, citizens are at the center, and we get to bring our expertise in service of the greater good, of the commons. And right now, I think, Maya, the issue all over, and it's particularly acute in the global south, is that the role of the citizen is being defined as that which happens after the important work of the professional, the expert, the one who knows is done. So this is a classic colonial trope. It's also racist. It's also gender biased. So it keeps me and my kind, right, too male, too pale, and too stale in positions of privilege, right? And so what we got to try and figure out, I think, and this is on all of us, and, nobody is exonerated from democracy, right? We all get to play, is how do we do something in each of our particular positions which is useful around that, that question that you've asked. And I honestly believe that some of it is kind of down to even things like this. It's quite fringe, but the fringe is a really interesting place to play, and stuff can grow from the fringe. Really, really interesting stuff can grow from the fringe. So increasingly, in the global south, what I'm beginning to really see is some very, very interesting possibilities. I always think that best practice is the enemy of better practice. But I think what we're beginning to see, and it's really, really interesting, is in a world that really privileges mile-wide, inch-deep solutions, that the people who are really making the biggest difference are people who are going, kind of inch-wide, mile-deep. So if I could give an example of this, because otherwise it gets abstract and, we kind of, we become untethered and unrooted. But my favorite examples of this is kind of not to create good cop, bad cop, but just as a kind of a comparators. You take somebody like Trevor Bayliss, the British inventor who invented the wind-up radio in the 90s as a response to AIDS and HIV in Africa. Now you might say, what's a wind-up radio got to do with AIDS and HIV in the 90s in Africa? Well, actually, most African villages don't have a reliable power source for electricity. Now, here's a guy, right, who's thinking, I actually believe that the people who live in those villages, if they got the information, would make really good choices, but they're not getting access to information. If I can cut out the middleman and the kind of interpreters and actually put the information directly in their hands, I think they'd probably make just the same sort of choices as I would. And so he does that, right? So I think that's a really interesting mindset. Then you take somebody like Norman Borlaug, who came up with the so-called miracle seed. You remember this, some of you might remember this in the 60s and the 70s. This guy won the Nobel Peace Prize in the 1970s. If you go onto Wikipedia right now and you Google Norman Borlaug, B-O-R-L-A-U-G, you'll read honors roll. You think this guy is amazing. He saved billions of people. But actually then Google criticism of Norman Borlaug. What you find is the work that he did in the Punjab, for example, the ground area where the seeds that he invented during the so-called Green Revolution, 1/4 of the landmass of the Punjab is now salt. It's desert. So we're going to see the exact same thing, Maya, with the World Bank. If they keep going ahead with their insistence on electrification schemes, we're going to see the exact same thing, I would think, around the Gates Foundation. So there's something here about us challenging very big imperial institutions, particularly the ones who believe they can only do good. And we've got to dethrone them. And that, by the way, isn't about just protest marches, but we've got to be a little bit more sophisticated, but we've got to change the conversation. So there's something here about this is contested space. We don't just all get to hold hands and send kumbaya as we walk into the sunset. Some of this actually means that our freedom to be citizens requires us to voice up, clean up, show up, and grow up. Don't know if that answers your questions necessarily, but soapbox over.
It answers your question, and thank you for touching on the Green Revolution, because I do feel like that is top of the agenda at Davos, which ended last week anyway, which is, but it's all right.
Yeah.
And that really does play Cormac into the whole thing about was when we choose our freedom, the price that we choose. And I think as Peter Block says too, with freedom comes anxiety. The anxiety piece, how do we lean in and do it anyway as it moves? So it's great stories, Cormac, as we go. So thank you for your contributions and sharing. So I think we do want to move into our breakout just to kind of talk a bit about. So Maya's going to put the question in the breakout. And just what we're going to do for this, as we've all been sitting and listening, is just basically what struck you about what Cormac shared with us over the last 20 minutes or so. Anything that kind of struck you, and have a dialogue with your small group. I think we'll do that. Let's see, we'll do 10 minutes for that. I think, Maya, max of 10, just to see, then we'll come back and do a kind of a final dialogue with each other. So let's head to our breakout rooms. And the in your chat is the question: what struck you about what Cormac has shared with us? And then we'll come back together and see where we go after that.
Open them in 1 second.
I could have stayed in that conversation for the rest of my career life, but for the piece going. So just as we kind of finish this up, not necessarily what struck you, but anything from your small group conversation, thoughts, comments, insights, questions with Cormac, kind of as a dialogue. If there's something that's kind of has stuck with you, kind of encourage us for the next few minutes just to kind of interact in that way. So just open your mic, raise your hand, your physical hand or your Zoom hand, and just share something into the community here on your thoughts, questions as we begin to close out from Cormac's storytelling today.
Yeah, I could start. I'm grateful to Cormac for the idea that there's no summit here, that it's a daily practice.
And I want to say thank you. I think I mentioned in our group that I saw this. I kept thinking about the whole notion of leader as convener. And you really talked to us, Cormac, about what that means and what we need to be considering as leaders, as conveners, and in convening groups. So thank you for that.
I have some work I've been asked to do that has made me uncomfortable, and I haven't been sure why, and I have a little bit more clarity today about why I'm uncomfortable. So I'm grateful for that.
Thank you, Carl. I think as I continue to learn, my aliveness and my being usually comes from being uncomfortable. And I want to move toward that and find out why and take some action. And the whole thing of, like Maya said, the difference between rage and outrage. It's funnel that as I have a responsibility for my life and the citizens and in this world that we are in. So. All right, folks. Well, we are toward the end. We at the end of our set aside time. So thank you, Cormac, for who you are, what you do, and for sharing that piece. So continue to stay connected that way.
Thank you all.
If you're interested, I put the link in for the connected community, the most recent work that Cormac has done with John McKnight. So I put the link there if you want to click there. Really, from an invitation perspective, folks, we really want to continue these stories. So love for you to volunteer, or if you know folks that you cross that would be willing to be a storyteller. It's very little work. We work with you and ask you questions and just share as we really, for me, build hope and to see what's going on. It can be lonely out there in this work that we're doing. So this is a way, at least for me personally, that I can connect and do that. And it is a journey. Thank you, Cormac. Definitely is a journey. And we are fellow sojourners on that journey. And I encourage each of you to reach out to folks maybe you've met today to join the journey they are on, or invite them to be on your journey. That's how this piece is going to continue to move forward. So join us next time for our next storyteller. One of our fellow sojourners on our call today, Peter Pula, will be our storyteller as we move forward at the last part of February. So encouraged to see. So with that, folks, I think maybe this is something that Peter Pula, you have done. Everybody unmute your microphone at one time, and at the count of 3, say so long in another way you want to say so long for the day. So unmute your mic. 1, 2, 3.
Ciao.
Maybe
Travels.
Bye. Hi, Nina.
Great to see you all again.
Cormac, thanks
Hi,
again.
Eva.
Yep.
It's a pleasure. Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Right.
Talk soon.
Beautiful. We will, for sure.
I literally have I'm diving into another call now, but we'll catch up. We should all try and just keep these conversations alive.
We will, for sure.
A year in between is far too long.
It is way too long.
True say.
Way too long. Bye, Cormac. Take care.
Talk soon.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. We'll
Be well.
continue. We got along with the commenter, we have a gapper now, right? That's going to be my
That's
other.
right. All right, friends. Thanks very much. Great call.
All right, Peter, take care. Bye-bye.